Hi, this is Matt McCormick. I'm in the Department of Philosophy at California State University, Sacramento, and this is my second introductory lecture for my Philosophy of Mind course, Phil 153. And I'm calling these two lectures Consciousness, Divide, and Conquer. This is part two. It's an introduction to some important concepts in studying and understanding the mind. So here's what we're doing. The idea is and this is the way I've built the course, is that if we develop, build out our knowledge of this interdisciplinary field of neuroscience, psychology, philosophy, cognitive science, we're able to separate, clarify, analyze, and we'll build a theory of mind that will solve the mystery of consciousness. Now, there's some people in the field who think that the mystery of consciousness can be solved. In fact, there's some people that they jokingly call them Mysterians. I'm not in that camp, but we also can't conduct a course if we don't at least give it a shot. So that's what we're up to here. My view is that once we're equipped with more carefully defined concepts that clarify the different functions, the aspects, the nuances of consciousness, and address the way we talk about it in ordinary language versus the way we talk about it in these expert fields, once we know more from neuroscience and psychology about how the brain works, then we can better understand what the mind is, how it works, and even how to build one. So all of these people in these fields, philosophy, neuroscience, psychology, and so on, have all contributed to this project. And we're making remarkable progress. There's been a lot more done than you realize. And I'll give you a list of books to take a look at after when we're done with this discussion. So my idea is that we divide and conquer, and then we're going to understand what the mind is. We're going to be able to build a theory mind that lets us understand what consciousness is, how it works. Okay, so let's introduce some new concepts to add on to the list that we got from last time. And I'll review the ones from last time in a minute. So very important concept in neuroscience, and one that you're intimately familiar with, it's attention. So in neuroscience, and I'm lifting a lot of this from Michael Graziano at Princeton. There's also, this has come to be the sort of standard way that people look at what attention is. The way they think about attention when they study it empirically, what they mean is they call it selective signal enhancement. You know when you're attending to something, but when we watch something like that cat attending closely to that bird has captured the cat's attention. That's selective signal enhancement. Okay, what does that mean? Well, attention is singular. It's a focused, limited cognitive labor that's dedicated to that one subject or that object, that thing that it's focused on. It's inhibitory of other signals with humans and with cats and lots of other creatures. If that cat's focusing on the bird, it's going to make it harder for it to be aware of other things that are going on around it. We can often direct your attention voluntarily. You can have some top-down direction of it, where you're pointing your attention at something, or you can have your attention captured, that is bottom-up capture, so that particular contents or states move into C1 consciousness or C2 consciousness. Okay, so using the distinction from Dehaene from last time about C0 consciousness. The presence of the bird has to register in the cat's cognitive neural system out the window. So the flittering catches the bird's eye, or the cat's eye, and then that captures the cat's attention, and now the cat dedicates some cognitive resources to looking at, watching, keeping track of that bird very carefully. The same way you do if you look across the room, you make the door your center of attention, or maybe a sudden loud noise that happens might grab your attention involuntarily. If a book falls on the floor behind you or someone startles you, it grabs your attention. You forget about what you were looking at and you focus on that. That becomes the object of cognitive work and effort, and lots of neural mechanisms are dedicated to representing, planning, processing, talking about, remembering, moving into short-term memory, doing lots of work on that signal that just came in. Or maybe you directed it around. Okay, so now I can make a distinction between attention and awareness. Now we use those, and I've even used that term sloppily in this previous lecture. We use those very loosely in normal conversation. We're going to get a theory of awareness from Michael Graziano in this course that's based on the work in his lab. So let me build it out from attention. Attention is attended stimuli have a boosted level of cognitive resources and systems dedicated to them. So when you attend to some stimuli, you're focusing more on it. And attended stimuli exert a much greater influence than unattended stimuli in other brain systems. So if that cat's looking at that bird, you know, his stomach's growling and he's thinking about it and he's got other things focused on it. Attention is selective signal enhancement. Awareness, on Graziano's term, is the brain's internal model of the process of attention. Okay, so you've been able to look at that picture and follow along with what I've talked about, where I've said the cat's paying attention to the bird, and that makes perfect sense to you. In fact, it's immediately obvious to you when you look at the picture. That's because you have this thing, awareness. You have a cognitive model of what attention is. You know what it is for, and in fact, it's effortless. You don't think about it. It just happens automatically. You just know that that cat's thinking about that bird. The cat is thinking about the bird. Okay, that's something that was immediately obvious to you because you've got a model that lets you think about minds and what their contents are and what they are thinking about and where the cat's attention is dedicated or devoted and where the cat's attention is not. So in addition to being able to attend to some stimuli to the exclusion of others, we have a capacity to represent that act of attention in ourselves or others. That's awareness. And some other creatures have it too. Chimpanzees have it. Chimpanzees know when you're looking at something, or they know, they have some theory of mind, they know what you know and know what you don't know to some extent. They can model what, there's empirical evidence that shows that they can model what you're thinking about and versus what you're not thinking about. So they've got some level of awareness in this more rich and technical sense from Graziano. So awareness as a cognitive mechanism makes it possible for me to see that the bird has caught the cat's attention. That lets me recognize that situation versus just seeing pixels on a screen and not recognizing the nature of the thing that's going on there. I know that the cat's got a mind of sorts and the cat's thinking about the bird. That's awareness, being able to do that. Okay, so one of the really interesting points that comes out of Graziano and some other work that I've been looking at lately is that we know that attention and awareness evolved. And part of what we're trying to do here is understand consciousness. Okay, well, if you want to understand consciousness, you need to understand where it came from and when it came on the scene. So selective signal enhancement, that ability to dedicate extra cognitive resources to some subject to the exclusion of others, that comes up on the scene about 500 million years ago in evolutionary history. And then later, awareness, or that ability to model attention itself, comes on the scene around, what is that, 200 to 250 million years ago. Having an internal model of attention or something like awareness, that comes later. And then as early as 65 million years ago, you get something he calls social attribution of awareness, which is a much more robust phenomenon that you see in some primates. So in the grand evolutionary scheme of things, this chart represents the origins of life on Earth right here at the bottom of the tree, and then it spreads out across to bacteria and all the way across, and humans are way over here at the bottom right-hand corner right here. Dinosaurs happened here and evolved and then were extinct. And attention shows up on the scene right around where I've circled here on the evolutionary tree. That's where it occurs, and then awareness in this more robust sense comes up on the evolutionary scene much later and further down the tree out there on the right. So there's a very interesting big discussion to have more about the details about the evolution of consciousness in this regard, but I'm just going to hint at that for now. So one of the good questions we got to ask if we're going to figure out what consciousness is we got to ask, well, who has attention, who has awareness or mind? And again, I'm going to draw from Graziano here. He uses this example. A hydra is a really simple, primitive freshwater organism. It's like a little plankton guy. And it has an undifferentiated ganglial net. So it's got a very primitive nervous system, but it's not differentiated. And by differentiated, what we mean is its neurons are not hierarchical. There's no brain. There's not even a ganglion cluster. They don't have such distinct functions from each other. All the neurons more or less do the same thing. There's no tiered or central processing. So it's not a heavy thinker, the hydra. And it doesn't have attention because it doesn't dedicate special neural resources or energy or one segment of its neural system to one's kind of processing versus another. So when you go back on that, that's how we know on the evolutionary tree where attention comes on the scene. It comes on the scene after the hydra. The hydra doesn't have attention. Maybe the hydra has C0 consciousness in Dehaene's terms. I don't know what to think about that. We should talk about it. How about a garden snail? You think a garden snail has some kind of very primitive form of mind? Maybe it has C0. Don't know if it has qualitative states. Maybe it has some really primitive qualitative states. I think we can say without a lot of controversy, although this will bother some people, plants and rocks don't have neural systems. There's no real information processing there. They don't even have the equipment necessary for C0 consciousness, so they certainly don't have minds. And we can talk about that some more this semester, but I'm going to say that the line is down below the hydra. And just to sort of get you some background here on some of what's going on in neuroscience about this, here's a study where researchers discovered a way to sort of switch off a woman's consciousness on and off by stimulating her colostrum. There's been a lot of work on the colostrum in recent neuroscience work. This woman had epilepsy, so the team was using deep brain electrodes to record signals from different brain regions to work out where her seizures were originating. This is actually how they do a lot of this research. And one electrode was positioned next to the colostrum, which is that little purple bit on my picture there, the red arrows pointing to, an area that had never been stimulated directly before. And when the team zapped that area with high frequency electrical impulses, just a little bit of current, the woman lost consciousness. She lost attention, she lost awareness, she lost all of that. She stopped reading, she stared blankly into space, she didn't respond to auditory or visual commands, and her breathing slowed. It was like she just turned off. So maybe that's more like creature consciousness, that she just shut down when they zapped her there. And then as soon as the stimulus stopped, she immediately regained consciousness with no memory of the event whatsoever. So something's going on there through the colostrum. And part of the work they're doing is trying to figure out what's known as the neural correlates of consciousness. And we'll talk about that more when we do our neuroscience section in the course later. So there's really cool empirical work being done, and you can see how this is going to have philosophical implications about what it is to have consciousness when we can find those tight correlations about certain brain regions and functions and isolate them and sort of figure out what they do and how they do what they do and help us unpack our theory of mind. Okay, so then following, sorry about that. Next term, sentience is another term you'll hear in this context, coming especially from Peter Singer, the philosopher down the left. Sentience is the capacity to feel pain and pleasure. It's the way I'm going to designate that term for our course. And it's to have qualitative states, but especially pain and pleasure. In ethics, because of Singer, it's sometimes argued that having the capacity of sentience means that you qualify. It qualifies an entity for moral consideration or inclusion. So, being able to feel pain makes a golden retriever at least deserving of some moral consideration. We wouldn't let somebody just torture it or inflict unnecessary pain on it. Birch trees don't have sentience, and they don't have C0, C1, or C2 either. And we could separate those. We could separate sentience from C0, C1, and C2, and we will when we talk about artificial intelligence systems, because it seems to me that we ought to be able, or we may be able to soon be able to build systems that have C0, C1, and C2 consciousness, but maybe they don't have pleasure and pain because they don't have the right kinds of connectionist network for it. But the claim that birch trees don't have sentience sometimes bothers people. I'm just going to throw it out there and leave it. Golden retrievers have it, chimps do, and humans do mostly. They have sentience. Okay, but that being said, I'm not going to talk about sentience much more in the course, although we will talk about some pleasure and pain examples. We will talk about representation quite a bit, because most philosophers of mind these days are representationalist, or they endorse representational theories of mind. So The view is that cognitive systems represent. It looks something like, or at least my little metaphor here with Homer Simpson's head, is that there's an object on the outside and then something, some information construct on the inside, then stands for, or represents the thing on the outside. Now, obviously, the thing inside the skull is not a red triangle. There's no red in there. There's no triangles in there. It's dark and wet. There's no colors. There's no feels. There's nothing like that. But there are some information structure or some neural firing patterns or some clusters or sequences of causal events inside the skull that are capturing the presence or absence of a red triangle or a thought of a red triangle or the capacity to, use the word red triangle in a sentence. Cognitive systems represent that way. That's what they do. They have information inside. Stimuli are presented to or impact the system. Those are perceptions, perhaps. And the cognitive system encodes that perception as information that has causal relationships in the nervous system to other encodings. The cognitive system then represents that encoding, because there's not a red triangle that goes in there. There's some other information data structure in various subsystems where it then plays a role. It bounces around in there and does some other things. It is stored in memory. It prompts action. It becomes part of a model that has identified other salient features of the world. It makes predictions and so on. So, red triangles take up residence inside the head and in your models. At the very simplest level, and I won't say that a thermostat has a mind, but we could say that a thermostat represents the temperature of the house. That's just to say that there's something isomorphic with the temperature is an external property, and then the thermostat varies with the temperature in the house. The information structure in the thermostat captures it or reflects it somehow. Okay, so I like to talk about low-level representations. Another way of thinking this is in terms of C0 representations. So low-level representers, like these neurons in your visual cortex, they might be dedicated to very simple tasks, such as edge or color detection, and they're activated by stimuli from the sensory periphery. So you've got, in your visual cortex, for instance, you've got edge detectors, you've got vertical line detectors, horizontal line detectors, and then they're further up the neural hierarchy. There are neurons that when the previous two both fire, that neuron fires because that means there's a corner, because you've got a vertical edge and a horizontal edge coming together. The activation of the horizontal edge detector by itself is not an organized representation of the object or even the edge. You got to have a lot more, and you have to have a whole lot more going on inside the brain, a much higher level representation for a verbal report to say something like, that's an edge or that's a corner. That would require me engaging many more systems and much more high level representation than the mere work of that first neuron. So you got to start thinking about neural processing in hierarchies, and then start thinking about the contents of mind as being the outputs of these complex systems that work in concert together and then send or manipulate all this information and send it around to these different modules or different systems. Okay, I want to make a distinction, a new distinction about self-representation. You recall my chimpanzees poking out white X's on their heads in the previous lecture. Let me make a distinction between spatial versus epistemic self-representation. So spatial is easy. Some systems can locate themselves spatially and temporally in relation to other objects that they represent. So very simply put, a GPS system on your phone knows where it is in terms of its relationship to the cell network. You pull up Google Maps and it shows where you are. And if you've got your wife or your husband on sharing on the map function, so it shows you where they are, it shows you where their phone is. So the phone has some very rudimentary representational capacity it has information structures in it that keeps track of where it is and puts it in a spatial and temporal relationship with other spatial temporal objects around it. So that's easy. You know where you're sitting right now. You know the location, position, and movement of your hands right now. I know that I'm sitting up and so on. I have a proprioceptive sense about the position, location, speed of my body. So that's all neural work that does that. But more interestingly, in the epistemic sense, that is having to do with knowledge, representation of the self as a cognitive or believing information decision-making agent. So when I say epistemic self-representation, there's something much more complicated going on. When I do something like I say to you, I know how to do calculus, or I need to get some coffee to stay awake. Okay, now that's me being aware of me, just a little bit like the phone is aware of where the phone is. But that's me being aware of something I know. I know how to do calculus. I actually don't know how to do calculus. So I know that I don't know how to do calculus. Okay, that's being aware of myself as an epistemic agent, as a believer, as a being with cognitive skills, and I know that there's one that I don't have, and I know that there are ones that I do have. So that's a very sophisticated level of I'm going to call it meta representation here in a minute, of self-awareness as a cognitive agent, not just as a location in space and time. So now I can get to this third sense of consciousness from Dehaene that I alluded to earlier in this discussion. And I said he had C0, C1, and C2 senses of consciousness. Okay, C2 consciousness is a system that's able to self-attribute states to itself. So when I say I know how to do calculus, or I know I'm hungry, or I know I'm sitting in my office, or I know I'm conducting a lecture, that's me being aware of myself. That's C2. That's when I am looking at myself and putting myself into a judgment and making a claim about my own states. So that includes introspective states, but it's not confined to those. That's C2 consciousness. And that requires a great deal more neural sophistication to have that capacity. Much harder to build a system like that. So now, another distinction that's relevant here that I want to raise, at least at this point, it fits here as well as anywhere else, is that in psychology, they'll use this term theory of mind. And they mean something different than what we mean in philosophy. So in psychology, when they talk about theory of mind, they'll say, well, that just means the ability to attribute mental states, attribute beliefs or intents or desires, emotions, knowledge to oneself and to others, and to understand that others have beliefs, desires, intentions, and perspectives that are different from one's own. So here's a famous experiment. You can take children, human children, and before a certain age, I don't recall the age, but when they're like, 18 months or 2 years old, you can take a doll and put it on the table, put it inside of a box so that it's now hidden. Somebody else comes in the room. The child doesn't really have a sophisticated theory of mind to recognize that the child, I know something that the person who just came in the room doesn't know. I know that the doll is under the box. But after kids get older, they know the joke. If you hide the doll under the box and then someone else comes in the room, the kid knows that the new person doesn't know that the doll's under the box. So when you say something like you're watching Game of Thrones and you realize, oh, well, he knows that she knows that he knows about the murder. Okay, that's a really, really complicated recursive sentence. He knows that she knows that he knows about the murder. But you can make perfect sense of that and you can keep track of that. That's because you've got theory of mind in this sense of theory of mind from psychology. You keep track of the minds and what's in them and what's not in them. And it turns out chimps have pretty sophisticated theory of mind too. So just having theory of mind means that you recognize when other creatures have minds and when they don't. It's similar to Graziano's sense of awareness. Awareness enables you to recognize attention in the world, and theory of mind is even more robust when we say a creature has theory of mind. Your dog doesn't really have theory of mind. You disappear for the day, you go away, you come home, the dog's surprised, there you are, you're back, but the dog wasn't really aware of what was going on in the interim. The dog just knows that they're happy now and they're about to get treats. But the dog doesn't have sort of sophisticated awareness of what you know, what you don't know. Or for instance, you've got Siri or you've got a Google Home, a Google unit in your house. Siri doesn't have theory of mind. If a Siri or Google Home did, it would be great, because if Google Home knew what I know and knew what I don't know, it could tell me things like, oh, there's some news that happened today. There was a terrorist attack and you don't know about it. You need to know about this because you're interested in this. Okay, now I know that about my wife, But Google Home doesn't know that about me because Google Home doesn't have theory of mind. It's not that complicated, not that sophisticated. Although we're going to get to AI systems very soon that have theory of mind, and they can keep track of what you know, what you don't know, and then they're going to deliver very salient, very important information to you because they've developed an account of what sorts of things you like, what things you don't like, what do you want, what do you not want. Now, I know what the algorithm on Netflix already does that, but it doesn't do it with theory of mind. It just does it through sort of brute computation. Having theory of mind means you know there's contents and beliefs and desires and goals and knowledge in that other mind, and you know when it's lacking. Okay, now in philosophy of mind, in philosophy, or theory of mind in philosophy, what we're talking about when we do theory of mind in philosophy is that it's the sub-discipline of philosophy devoted to studying the nature of minds or consciousness. So it's kind of related, but it's different than when we say a creature has a theory of mind, and when they do that research in primatology or in psychology. Okay, so I mentioned metacognition. Metacognition is thinking about thinking. And this is this recursive ability that you've got. And you're very good at this. And I'll give you some examples of some questions that invoke metacognition. Do you know what a tufa is? And you immediately have a kind of sense about whether or not you know what that word means. You probably don't. Maybe you do. But what I'm focusing on is the sense that you know or you don't know what you know. It's that second meta level awareness. Or how confident are you that you won't get a parking ticket today? Okay, so I'm not asking about parking ticket. I'm asking about your confidence. I'm asking you to think about your confidence about that. Oh, I'm not so sure that I won't get a ticket. How drunk are you right now? That's metacognition. You hear yourself talking or slurring your words or doing something, and you think to yourself, wow, you're really drunk. That's metacognition. That's you being aware of your own state. How did you do on the calculus test? That is your awareness of your own performance. So that's thinking about your own thinking. How good are you at picking boyfriends or girlfriends? You might have a theory about that. You might have a story to tell about it. You might think you're bad at it. What are you thinking about right now? That is metacognition, to think about what you're thinking about. Okay, so that's going to turn out to be a really important, really interesting component, especially when we start talking about artificial intelligence later in this course. Like, we want to know how that works. We want to know how that functions. That's going to be one of the keys, I'll argue later, to sort of the next level in building smart, super intelligent artificial intelligence. Okay, so here's what we've been doing. We've been, on my account, introducing a bunch of terms, concepts from neuroscience, psychology, philosophy to clarify and sharpen and define these different aspects of mind so that we can understand better what consciousness is. So we, in the first lecture, talked about qualia. That's the subjective feel when you taste the lemonade or you see a ripe tomato. And we've talked about self-consciousness now. And we've even talked about it in terms of spatial or epistemic self-consciousness. We've defined and talked about what introspection is. We have introduced the C0, C1, C2 distinction from Stanislas Dehaene about different levels of cognitive processing. Really important neuroscientific theory that's getting a lot of attention, a lot of work lately. We've introduced the notion of attention as selective signal enhancement. Some cognitive systems have the capacity to focus on particular stimuli, boosting the system resources dedicated to it to the exclusion of other stimuli. Think about that cat focusing on that bird. That's attention. And your ability to recognize the cat's attention is awareness. You are aware, that is, you've got this cognitive capacity to look around the world and recognize attention when you see it. That's because you've got awareness. Cats may not have that, may have some of it. It's modeling one's capacity to perceive, or other people's capacity to have attention. Sentience is the capacity to feel pain or pleasure. And then we've talked about the representational aspects of theories of mind, and that's the capacity to register a stimuli, encode it, and then employ it across various cognitive modules. I think I've got self-representation there, so that's actually not different from self-consciousness. Metacognition is thinking about thinking, And finally, I promised that I would address this issue about how the claim is that we don't know anything about the mind, right? I think that's bullshit. I think we know a lot about the mind. People say, oh, well, we have no idea how consciousness is produced by the brain. I think that's false. And they also say it's a bit like this urban myth where people say we only use 10% of our brains. That's false. It's absolutely not true. It keeps getting repeated, but it's an urban myth. So if you're inclined towards any of those, towards that idea that we don't understand consciousness, you're not qualified to say that until you've read at least these 10 books. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 books. Here's 7 really good recent books, most of them by philosophers and neuroscientists, that give us some remarkably powerful, empirically sensitive theories of mind that unpack what it is to be conscious. Okay, so that's my reading list on top. We'll actually read a few articles from some of these authors in this course, but that's my second lecture introducing this whole consciousness divide and conquer approach that I'm going to take in the course to let us now start diving in and unpacking what it is to be conscious with these conceptual clarifications in mind, and then we can start sort of believing that it's possible to bridge the gap from neurons to, you know, falling in love or sonatas or having a daydream or what have you. All right, so that's the end of my second introductory lecture.